All of the life that we see shares one thing in common, and this isn't a particularly enlightening thing, but it's the fact that everything is multicellular. From the worms to the birds to the weird fishes and the whales in the sea, well, it's all multicellular. As I said before, this isn't particularly enlightening, but it is very important to realize when we trace our ancestry back to the dawn of time. 4.5 billion years ago, the Earth is created. 3.7 billion years ago, almost instantaneously considering the slow march of geological time, single-cellular life comes into existence. 600 million years ago, 3 billion years after single-celled organisms, we see our first multicellular organisms in the Ediacaran period, which is what I'll be talking about today. But before I talk about those, I first have to talk about these. Stromatolites, and pictured here is me with a stromatolite. An old one, a dead one, but an albeit very important one. Stromatolites are made up of cyanobacteria. Cyanobacteria are with us today, and they're not something you think about normally, but they were the first to photosynthesize. 4.5 billion years ago, when the Earth was created, the atmosphere, the sky, was completely toxic, full of cyanide and sulfur. If you took a time machine back and you stepped out into the early atmosphere, you would be dead in minutes. So, how did this change? Well, again, our stromatolite friends. Since they're photosynthesizing, they're producing oxygen. So for 3 billion years before we have multicellular life come onto the stage, they're making oxygen. And this leads to the great oxidization event, which oxidizes the air. Eventually the ocean gets oxidized, and now we finally set the scene, because of these guys, for the Ediacaran period, for nature's great experiment.
And that finally brings us here to the Miller Museum at Queen's University. Behind me is a replication of the Ediacaran seafloor from Mistaken Point, Newfoundland. When all of these animals lived, there was a volcanic ash layer that enveloped them and fossilized them. Due to plate tectonics over the years, this was pushed up onto the coast of Newfoundland, and all of that fossilized volcanic ash was eroded away, showing us these fossils. When you look at these fossils, there's one thing that's very clear in them, and that's their construction. See, my hand is roughly the size of these organisms, and my hand requires thousands of unique cells in order for it to function. Unique cells use a lot of genetic information, and that is space of genetic information that these animals did not have. So they had to rely on one very clever little trick, and that is fractal construction. Fractal construction is repeating the same tiny structure over and over and over again until the desired size is reached. And that's exactly what they did, repeating that same structure over and over and over again, requiring very little genetic material. Most of these animals were filter feeders. So what happened to them? Because we don't see any evidence of them in the Cambrian. And the answer is those. Specifically, predation. None of these animals were predators. They were all filter feeders, eating the soil and the nutrients within it. But when evolution evolved predators, they couldn't stand up. They had soft skin. They couldn't move. So they were ripped to shreds by those newfound predators. And that led to the Cambrian explosion, where bones and brains became the mainstream, where everything evolved to have them, and they couldn't keep up. So they went extinct.
And now we come back to where we started, back in, well, my dingy college room. It may be easy to look at these animals and wonder, well, why do we care? And sure, you cannot care. I mean, plenty of people don't look back in history, but it is interesting to look back, to see how far we've come. From these animals that couldn't see or hear or sense, that existed almost as plants, to me and the birds outside of my window. It's a beautiful journey to follow. Everything that we can see, everything that we can taste and touch and pet, all of it shares the same story as us. We all come from a long line of evolution, and it's a beautiful thing to watch as we've evolved. These things didn't know what predation was, and now we have rabbits running from eagles in the sky. It's astonishing to see how the world changes, and it's truly a beautiful thing. And I'm glad that I get the opportunity to share with you that story, because I think it's one that we should all know. We should all be able to trace our ancestry back to, well, our roots and back to where our planet starts. Thank you.